It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Yarrow Axford, who's here today thanks to funding from the Institute of Arctic Studies at the Dickey Center, and also the IGERT program in polar environmental change. Yarrow got her bachelor's at Mount Holyoke College in '97, which is where we met, taking geomorphology together my sophomore year, which was super fun. She got her master's at Utah State University, and in 2007 earned her PhD at University of Colorado, and she's now an assistant professor at the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Northwestern. Yarrow was also an IGERT fellow at University of Colorado in their program, which is Carbon, Climate, and Society. She's also been a nominee and finalist for the AAAS Early Career Award for Public Engagement with Science. And today at our IGERT lunch, we had a really fun discussion about communicating science and talking with journalists, and it was a really useful conversation. She's also an accomplished field geologist. She's had over 15 field campaigns to the Arctic, including Alaska, Iceland, Baffin Island, and Greenland. And as you'll see today, she does really cool interdisciplinary science. So please join me in welcoming Yarrow Axford.
Thank you, Laura. And we're going to attempt a different microphone, which so far is not working very well. I'll try standing over here. Is this working better? Okay. I actually have a long history of mishaps with microphones, so if this is not working, it's hard for me to tell. Someone please give me a signal. Honestly, I really want to know if it's not working, and we'll fix things. Thanks so much to all of you for the opportunity to speak to you today and to visit campus. It's really been a lot of fun to meet a steady stream of people who study the Arctic environment from a really wide range of perspectives. Sounds like my voice is being tweaked. Shall I try the podium? Is this better? Thumbs up? Okay, thank you. You guys have so much great stuff going on here on campus, and it's really been a special pleasure to meet students from the IGERT program. As an IGERT alum myself, as a special nod to the IGERT students, I put a photo here of Ken Gerlusoak. I don't actually do research in this area, but I got to help someone take a core there once. So that's there for you, IGERT students. And my goal today is to have you hopefully leave agreeing with me that not just mud, but glaciers and bugs are all pretty marvelous, especially if we take a geologic approach and we use those three things to reconstruct past climate change and past changes in the environment, and in turn use the information that we glean from paleoclimate to better understand what's happening in the Arctic today and where we might be going in the future. I want to acknowledge that all the work I'll talk about is highly collaborative, and especially I want to acknowledge some local collaborators here at Dartmouth, Meredith Kelly, Eric Osterberg, and Laura Levy. It's a real pleasure to work with these folks on work at Greenland and Greenland. I'll talk about that just briefly towards the end of my talk today. Many of you are probably very familiar with the very wide range of rapid environmental changes that are taking place in the Arctic today. The decline of summer Arctic sea ice extent is one of many. It's one that's sort of probably best known to the general public, probably in part because it is so astonishingly rapid, a huge change in the Arctic environment. It's very visible. That change and the Arctic in general have become sort of the poster children for global climate change. And I think that's really appropriate when you consider that, yes, climate across the globe as a whole is changing, and you can see that in this plot of the temperature anomaly for the last decade, but that's especially true in the Arctic and subarctic. And that amplification of climate change in the Arctic has been a feature of Earth's climate system for a very long time. We know that thanks to paleoclimate research. This is truncating my slides a little bit. There should be a credit down here. This is from a paper by Giff Miller and colleagues in 2010. The authors of this paper attempted to summarize the amount of global temperature change that was associated with 4 past periods of Earth's history and the corresponding Arctic temperature change during those periods. So we're going from quite cold here. This is the last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age. And these should all be labeled. I apologize. We just don't have the labels. This is the Pliocene. So this is a period about 3 million years ago when global sea level was probably something like 25 meters higher than today. And the whole globe was significantly warmer than present, but of course that's much more the case up in the Arctic. So persistent feature of Earth's climate system, what can this tell us potentially about where we're going in the future? So here I'm just doing a little back of the envelope exercise and plotting some information from the latest IPCC report just released a few months ago. This is what IPCC, roughly what's reported in the AR5 as a likely range of warming by the last couple decades of this century. And this big range reflects the fact that there are several possible emission scenarios, very different emission scenarios embedded in here. What does that mean for the Arctic the last couple decades of this century? Well, warming somewhere in there. And if we express that in degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is valuable because that's sort of a more personally intuitive metric than degrees Celsius for a lot of people, we're looking at something roughly between about 2 and 34 degrees Fahrenheit warming around the Arctic by the end of this century. Two things about that. That's a huge range. So obviously the future of the Arctic is very uncertain, and the top end of that range is obviously a lot of warming. So as a paleolimnologist, I work to reconstruct past environmental change, and I'm very just inherently interested in Earth's past, but I also like to try to learn what I can about present day climate change and where we may be going in the future using this method. And working with lakes is an opportunity to be very creative because lakes are just remarkable archives of past environments. If you think about the pond here on campus, is it Occam Pond? If you think about mud that's accumulating at the bottom of that pond year after year, and what that mud is made of, it's made out of bits and pieces of anything that's living in the lake and dies there, anything that washes into the lake water, anything that blows over the lake. All of that is potentially sinking to the bottom and preserved in the sediment record. And all of those things, in turn, are parts of the surrounding landscape or parts of the lake ecosystem that reflect something about past climate. So there's a sort of infinite array of chemical, biological, and physical tracers captured in these lake sediments that can tell us just a multitude of things about past environments and ultimately, in some cases, past climate. I wanted to show a few photos from the field to give you a sense of how we recover sediment records from lakes in the Arctic. The first step is to get down into the water, to send some sort of tube down towards the mud at the bottom of the lake. And if you core in winter or spring, here this is Baffin Island in May, you've got to get through ice. And in Baffin Island on May, there's about 7 feet of ice, a couple meters of ice over the lake. So it's kind of a hassle. In summer, there are different challenges. Coming up with a way to give yourself enough buoyancy and stability to be able to pull a core, anchoring a boat in windy conditions and so on. So we use all sorts of bizarre versions of rafts and boats and tripod contraptions and things to allow us to pull sediment cores. And the coring devices themselves are quite diverse depending on whether you're trying to capture the surface, the uppermost sediments, or a deep record, and whether you're working in a shallow or a deep lake. This is an example of a sediment core, a very short sediment core recovered from a lake in East Greenland. This is with Laura and Meredith a couple years ago in their field area near Scoresby-Sutton. And I like to show this because the laminations in these sediments make it clear how beautifully the stratigraphy of the lake sediments is preserved for us and undisturbed really in the coring process. And this particular core extends all the way up to the modern environment, the modern benthic environment of the lake. And you can even see here, this is a little chironomid larva that's escaped from its habitat here. So this sediment record would extend from sometime back in the past all the way up to present day. Just another example of a core, because these tubes are clear, you can see pretty clearly this color change, some sort of major environmental change recorded in that color change. A core from Alaska, where you see a lot of horizontal banding. Most of those layers are tephra, or volcanic ash layers. But between those volcanic ash layers are, as I mentioned, a really diverse range of materials, preserved that tell us things about past environments. Pollen grains, this is a volcanic ash grain, insect remains, the remains of a diatom. My PhD research and a lot of my subsequent work has focused on using insects as recorders of past temperatures. Specifically, I'm talking about a family of flies called chironomids, or non-biting midges. You probably encountered them as swarms of relatively benign seeming insects. You wonder kind of what their purpose is in life, because they just kind of swarm around in these clouds. You can see them swarming here pretty clearly. This is near a lake in Iceland. They're very abundant around most Arctic lakes and ponds, and really anywhere in the world where there's freshwater habitat. And fortunately for me, they have parts that are preserved in the sediment record, and their species distributions, especially in cold regions, tend to be very temperature dependent. So we can look at sediments in the lab after just some basic pre-treatment, physically pick the remains of chironomid larvae out of the mud. And what we find are these head capsules that are made of chitin, and they preserve just beautifully in the sediment. This is looking at these under higher magnification, looking at mouth parts. And you can look at the number of teeth, whether there's an odd or even number, their relative sizes, and then other features of the morphology to tell usually what genus of chironomid you have. Sometimes we can identify them to the species level. And so interpretation of these guys in a sediment record is really based on this very intuitive concept of species-environment associations. You all already have this in your head. If you were blindfolded by some friends who wanted to give you a surprise vacation, and they sent you off somewhere and then removed the blindfold, and you saw this guy, you would have a very good sense where in the world you were and what sort of climate regime you're occupying, because this organism is associated with a very specific type of environment, and the same for this bear here, and of course palm trees, spruce trees, same basic idea. Temperature is by no means the only thing that determines where you find palm trees versus spruce trees, right? But a lot of the things that determine some of these species distributions are either directly or indirectly related to temperature. And in the case of chironomids in Arctic, it seems from modern calibration work that temperature is the dominant driver of species distributions, but certainly not the only one. So you don't actually need to do anything mentally with this diagram. It's just kind of here as an example of a biostratigraphic diagram showing you the percent abundance of a bunch of different chironomid taxa up through a core. It's just a sample of such a diagram showing you what down core data look like. And we can interpret these data qualitatively based on what we know about the modern distributions of species. But we can also kind of take it a step further or in a different direction and try to interpret these data quantitatively. By combining the down core data with what we know about modern species distribution and using statistical models, for example, weighted averaging models, to then derive from both of these pieces of information estimates in degrees C of past temperatures recorded by these assemblages. Despite the fact that there are an almost infinite range of environmental tracers preserved in lake sediments, not to mention marine cores and ice cores, there are surprisingly few methods out there that allow us to derive past temperatures, to infer past temperatures quantitatively like this in degrees C. And you can imagine this is a powerful thing to be able to do, because we want to be able to quantify the magnitude of past climate change, the rate of past climate change. So this is one of a bunch of methods that are really good to have in our toolkit as paleoclimatologists. This is just an example of a modern calibration study. This is work by my colleague Donna Francis, who looked at the modern midge assemblages present in lakes spread from Maine all the way up to the high Canadian Arctic, so a really broad climate transect across northeastern North America. And she found this strong correlation between actual temperature at all of these lakes and the temperature that was predicted by the chironomid assemblages that are present in the lakes today. And those happen to be the calibration data that I'll use to derive the temperature reconstructions that I show you today. But there are many calibrations from around the world and multiple calibrations from the Arctic region. So today I want to talk specifically about two lake sediment studies, one in Arctic Canada, where I ask how unusual is recent climate change and what can sediments tell us about that. And then the second is work around the margins of the Greenland ice sheet, considering what paleo data can tell us about the impacts of future warming. So we're going to go far from Hanover up to Baffin Island, 70 degrees north. Is my voice disappearing as I turn my head? Okay, thank you. This is the study site. We're on the lake here in May. And one of the things you should know about the site is it's very sort of classic Arctic in the sense that it's snow and ice dominated for most of the year. So the amplification and the feedbacks that I talked about before are certainly at play here. This site is also very remote from direct human influence. So it's a several kilometer snowmobile ride from the nearest village, which looks like this. And this is the main street of Clyde River. And this town itself is hundreds of kilometers from the nearest town this size. The lake itself is one of many, many, many on the landscape kind of nearby this town, and it's probably rarely, if ever, visited by people. So the direct human impact on this lake should be next to nothing. It should be, in a sense, one of the most pristine ecosystems on the planet. Another thing about working in this region is that thermometer records here, weather station records, are very, very short. So for the most part, weather stations were set up in this part of the world during the Cold War when runways were built in communities like this. And so meteorological records generally date back to the 1950s and 60s. So if you want to ask, is the 20th century different from what came before, you cannot do that with instrumental data here. And if you even want to ask, are the last few decades different from what came before, you just can't do it with instrumental data. So there's a real role for paleoclimate data to play. So we visited the lake several times over multiple years and recovered a really nice suite of cores and tubes like this in the case of long cores. Also paid a great deal of attention to trying to be sure that we captured the uppermost sediments in this lake intact. So the really recent sediment records. So you use a special core to do that, and we subsampled at 1/4 centimeter resolution, taking little slices off in the field, just to be sure that that soft, goopy upper mud made it home without disruption in the United Airlines baggage claim area or something. So I'm actually going to show data from this core here. And I wish that I knew of a way to be a paleoecologist and never show these diagrams. If anyone has a suggestion, please let me know. But I like to show raw data so that you can see what we have to work with. This is actually just a subset of the taxa that I identified from this core. There were 20-odd taxa at this site. But these are the most abundant or most interesting ones. So we're going back more than 2,000 years here. This is a radiocarbon and lead-210 dated record. And the main things I want you to hopefully notice here are there's sort of some overall large trends over this time period, maybe kind of a shift about halfway through this time period. The taxa that are over here on the diagram are generally cold indicators, warmer indicators, warm being very relative up here, or here. And so there's maybe a shift towards some of the colder indicators in the second half of this record. But then notice what's happening in the uppermost samples. A loss of this taxa, Oliveridia, which is basically the coldest dwelling chironomid in the calibration set. It only lives at the coldest Arctic sites today, or in glacier-fed lakes. Disappears from the lake around 1950 and doesn't come back. This cold indicator is also gone at that time. And some other species or taxa rise at that same time in relative abundance. So to summarize that as a temperature reconstruction, so combining that with calibration data, this is what we get for the last 2,000 years at this lake. And there's, I guess, a pretty clear take home to this. We don't have extremely high resolution back here, but we don't see anything that looks like what's happening in the 20th century. But this is just one site where I think there's fairly compelling evidence that at least the 20th century is warmer than any of the other time periods we've captured here over the last 2,000 years. But it's just one site. And so you should be asking, is that site representative of what's going on in a larger area? And so I want to tell you briefly about a larger study that I was fortunate enough to kind of play a really small role in. This is work that was led by Daryl Kaufman, published in 2009. And this was a collective effort by a large group of us to try to identify all published records that were out there at the time we were doing this study that estimated temperatures at least 1,000 years back into the past at a resolution of at least a data point every 10 years at all sites north of 60 degrees where this type of work was done. So basically, what are all the 1,000-year or longer temperature reconstructions available for the Arctic and subarctic? And this is what we found at that time that met the criteria. Blue are ice core records, lake records in red, and there were a couple tree ring records. A total of 23 records that went back at least 1,000 years, and most went back 2,000 years. So unlike the work I just showed you that was based only on chironomids, this is based on ice cores, tree rings, everything from annual sediment layer thickness to the abundance of primary producers in lake sediments. So it's a pretty wide range of archives and proxies. And we ultimately generated this temperature reconstruction, which weights each of those 23 records equally. So it doesn't weight each geographic part of the Arctic equally. There's some biases geographically because of the sampling, but it weights every record equally. This is the resulting temperature reconstruction. The red is instrumental data for the high northern latitudes. It looks kind of similar to the record that I showed you before from Lake CF8, I think. My record, incidentally, did not make the cut for this because the resolution was too low. So in addition to the warming that you see in the 20th century here, another thing that jumped out at us all was this long-term cooling trend. Of course, there's a lot of variability superimposed over that on shorter time scales, but a really conspicuous long-term cooling over the last 2,000 years. So those are a couple of our conclusions in this study, that the last century was a period of quite abrupt warming. In fact, each of the data points represented here is the average for a decade, and 4 of the 5 warmest decades in this whole record occur in the last, I believe it's century, and it might even be the last 50 years. The last data point here, the last decade in the record, is the warmest of the whole record. So that's interesting. I think that pattern is interesting, but what's maybe even more interesting is what we can say about the cause of temperature change at the site over time. So this plot is showing you solar insolation. This is the amount of solar radiation that's reaching Earth's surface at high northern latitudes in summer over time. And that number is going down and down and down pretty steadily and slowly over the last 2,000 years, just naturally due to changes in the precession of the equinoxes, Milankovitch. And so you might expect that climate would respond by cooling gradually, slowly over that time period. And indeed, that's what we see. Each of these dots is 1 century of that 2,000-year record, and that's 19 of the centuries in the record. Really strong correlation between this primary natural forcing of climate and temperature. We report in this paper also that if you look at the output of CCSM3 simulations for the mid-Holocene, climate model output for the mid-Holocene, you get almost exactly the same relationship between insolation and temperature at these latitudes. You get the same slope of this line. So it's sort of empirical and theoretical evidence for this strong relationship between insolation and overall Arctic temperature in the Holocene. But here's where the last century of the record plots on this diagram. We got the lowest solar insolation of the record and the highest temperature. So this has been true for the last 2,000 years, but it's not true for this century. So I want to talk a little bit about a more complex paleolimnological study, partly to just give you hopefully an appreciation for what a more multi-proxy collaborative paleolimnological study looks like. I want to go back to Lake CF8 and tell you about what we did after we looked at the last 2,000 years in this record, because it turns out that this lake is very unusual for the glaciated part of the Arctic in that it contains not just Holocene sediments, which is what you expect to find in Arctic lakes that were covered by an ice sheet and scoured out by an ice sheet during the last glacial maximum. This lake also contains 2 other prior interglacials recorded in its sediments that were preserved because this landscape was covered by a cold-based and non-erosive part of the ice sheet during the last glacial maximum. So that's the conclusion that was drawn by dissertation work by Jason Briner, who was at the University of Colorado when I was there. So we were both working on Baffin Island. He's a glacial geologist, and he discovered that the ice sheet indeed overrode this landscape during the last glacial maximum, deposited erratics like that. You probably have these on campus, I'm guessing. But it deposited them on a landscape that hadn't experienced much erosion during that glacial advance. And when you look at the beryllium-10 isotopes in this landscape feature, you see that it's actually been exposed to the atmosphere for a very long time and not scoured very much by ice. So on this landscape, you basically have a lot of landscape features that survive glaciation without being modified very much. And one of those landscape features is lakes that contain old sediments. So Lake CF8 contains 3 interglacials at least stacked on top of one another. So it's a really rare opportunity to look pretty far back in the history of an Arctic lake in a glaciated area. So this diagram is going to show you how good and how bad paleolimnology can get, because it's going to get really busy. But we're going to start with solar insolation forcing over the Holocene. So this is the last 10,000 years. This is that forcing I was talking about, and I'm just zooming in on the last couple centuries here. And then some summary of midge data for the whole Holocene. This is all the midges with cold temperature optima, cold indicators. How abundant are they over time? And then this is midge inferred summer water temperature. Warm temperatures here, cooler temperatures here, kind of following along with solar insolation as we would expect. This is the loss of cold-dwelling midges that occurs in the 20th century that I mentioned before. We can ask, now that we're looking through the whole Holocene, when was the last time they were absent from this lake? They were absent off and on in the early Holocene, when temperatures were apparently much warmer, and that was presumably driven by much higher solar insolation at that time. So now I'm adding diatom data and some geochemical data to this diagram. And we've got not just the Holocene, but the last interglacial, and at least the last part, the waning part of isotope stage 7. I'm not going to dwell on this diagram, but like I said, I like to show raw data, and this is really a summary diagram. These 3 diatom taxa are summarizing more than 100 taxa that were counted in the core. And the diatom work, I should mention, was done by colleagues at Queen's University and University of Alberta, John Small and Alex Wolf's research groups. Really great Arctic diatomists. So a couple take-homes from this. I'm going to summarize this in a different way, visually and statistically, in just a moment. So the point of my next few slides is to kind of summarize this for you. But I already pointed out that it seems like temperatures and what's going on with midges is following insolation quite well through the Holocene here. That's more or less true for diatoms as well, we think. And that seems to be true in past interglacials as well. A lot of the trends that we see in the Holocene are mirrored in the last interglacial, which is interesting. We can't directly compare these data with insolation forcing because optically stimulated luminescence dating that we use to date this period, those are dates in thousands of years, is not precise enough. It just tells us what interglacial we're in and not exactly where we are within that interglacial period. But we can kind of infer, because we see such similar trends and we know that this interglacial was driven by pretty similar trends in insolation, that you have this long-term phenomenon of these proxies being coupled pretty strongly to insolation forcing. Another thing I wanted to point out is that it's not just midges that change at the top of this core. There's some other interesting things going on, but it's very complex. Not every proxy is changing. Some proxies show unprecedented values, others definitely don't. So if I were to ask you or myself to summarize what does the 20th century look like in this lake relative to all the other older stuff, it's a really hard exercise to do, and it's hard to do objectively. So as part of this study, I decided to try using detrended correspondence analysis, which is a constrained ordination technique to try to answer that question. And DCA is very similar to PCA. It's intended for use with different type of data, with ecological data. But when you do a PCA on these same data, you get almost exactly the same results. So you can really think of it as very similar. These are the variables that I put into this analysis. So the 3 diatom taxa that I showed you before, which are kind of dominant and important. Midges divided into 3 groups based on their temperature optima, and then the 3 geochemical things that we measured. And if you're not familiar with reading these diagrams, the variables that plot near one another are variables that tend to covary down core. Now I'm plotting samples, but I'm really plotting time slices. We had to average several samples in a time slice because not every proxy was measured at exactly the same depth in the core. So we end up with time slices that contain several samples each. And one thing to know, again, if you're not familiar with these diagrams, is that samples that plot near one another are more similar to each other in terms of these 9 variables. Samples that plot in opposite quadrants of the diagram are very dissimilar. So I'm going to just remove the variables now. Actually, before I do that, I just want to point out that over in this quadrant in the diagram are going to be samples that have cold midge assemblages, high carbon to nitrogen ratios, not a lot of chlorophyll A, which we think is telling us about the primary productivity of the lake. These samples are going to record cold, low productivity conditions, opposite for this quadrant. Okay? And it's not at all random which samples plot where. All the samples, or all the time slices that date to periods of glacial onset. So this is the last part of MIS7, the last part of the last interglacial. Temperatures are cooling, cooling, cooling until you find yourself in a glacial period. These samples plot up here. Samples from full interglacial times. So most of the Holocene since deglacial times. The last interglacial, 5E proper probably, they plot over here in the opposite quadrant of the diagram. And then these are the samples or time slices. We have more samples than time slices. These are the time slices from the 20th century with their sort of midpoint ages in 8 years AD shown for you. And so one of the conclusions that I draw from this is that can kind of objectively say that overall, when you look across these 9 variables, the 20th century doesn't fall within the range of variability that we see in prior time slices over interglacials of the last 200,000 years. And it seems like maybe it's becoming more and more true over time, although that time trajectory is not based on a lot of time slices. So that's a more tentative conclusion. So to wrap up conclusions for this first and longer part of my talk, first of all, the magnitude of 20th century warming across the Arctic appears to be unique to the past 2,000 years. We see that in my record, and more powerfully, we see it across the Arctic in those 23 records. 20th century conditions, although probably not temperatures, and that's important, at Lake CF8, my site on Baffin, are unique within the past 200,000 years, or over 3 interglacials. So it looks like in terms of that combination of environmental parameters, the 20th century is outside the range of variability that we saw over this time period, and we could say maybe even likely over the Quaternary, because we capture some fairly warm conditions in that time. But it's really important for me to point out that I'm not saying the site is the warmest it's been in 200,000 years. I'm not even coming close to saying that, because it really looks like this site was warmer during the early Holocene and during the peak of the last interglacial. But those are the only 2 times in the record when the site was warmer than today. And those are also times when solar insolation was forcing climate to be warmer than it is today. So there's no mystery why climate was warmer at those times. That coupling between orbital forcing and temperatures seems to be lost now. Final conclusion there. So next I want to tell you about work that's really ongoing and in the early stages around Greenland, considering what did the Greenland ice sheet look like in past warmer times. And I want to basically give you a sense for what I'd like to know, why I think it's worth knowing, and then a little bit of data at the end from one of the studies that's in the later stages. So you probably all know that the Greenland ice sheet is very large, and if all the ice that's incorporated in that 2-mile thick continent-sized mass of ice somehow found its way to the ocean, we would raise global sea level by about 22 feet. And we're stuck on this planet with this unfortunate reality that shrinking land ice means rising sea level, for the most part. So we would really like to know what's the future of this ice sheet not to mention the much larger Antarctic ice sheet going to be. But that's unfortunately for society, but maybe fortunately for scientists, a really challenging and therefore interesting problem to work on. Because the loss of ice sheet mass to the sea is a complex thing, and this is not my area of research, and some of you focus on this. But I think it's safe for me to say that ice sheets can lose mass to the sea both by melt and by flow, or by dynamics. You can see both evidenced here on this glacier at the end of summer. Lots of evidence of melt, lots of evidence of flow. I had the good fortune to get to fly over this guy on the way to meet Meredith and Laura in the field. It was pretty great. So how do ice sheets work? How do flow and melt interact? How is the flow of an ice sheet likely to change in a changing climate? Unfortunately, those questions are very, very hard to answer because the dynamics of ice sheets are very complex. And I just love this image that shows this sort of circulatory system of an ice sheet. You can see right away that the rate of ice flow within this ice sheet varies by several orders of magnitude, depending on where you are. It's really complex. So if we want to try to figure out where ice sheets are going, and therefore where global sea level is going, I would say we basically have three options. One is to extrapolate, to say what's been happening with the ice sheet recently, how can we extrapolate that into the future, and what does that suggest about where we're going? I don't recommend that method, and I don't know that anyone would, in part because until recently there's been a great deal of uncertainty about what the ice sheet's even been doing recently. I think there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. It's my perception as an outsider. I'm not a glaciologist. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what's happening with Antarctica's mass balance. I think that glaciologists are converging on some understanding and some consensus about Greenland's mass balance change over time recently. These are some of the data that I've seen in the past couple years. And the overall picture seems to be one of accelerating mass loss over the past decade. So not only is the Greenland ice sheet kind of running in the red in the past decade or so, but it's increasingly down in the red as time goes by. There's a lot of year-to-year variability apparently superimposed over that trend. So how do you extrapolate something like that? Fortunately, there are a couple other options, and one is to try to get very good at modeling the physics of ice sheets so that we can use models to simulate where we might be going in the future. And since the last IPCC report in 2007, there's been, I think, a real effort on the part of the glaciological community to try to improve our ability to model the physics of ice sheets, leading up partly to the more recent IPCC report, which incorporates some of those improvements. So where are we at now? How well can we forecast future sea level? I think it's still an area of very large uncertainty and contention from what I can tell. But you can see some of that uncertainty here in this figure from the latest IPCC report. There's a lot of uncertainty about where we might be in terms of sea level by the end of this century, right? Some of that uncertainty, of course, has to do with not knowing which emissions sort of trajectory we might follow. But the really broad colored bands surrounding these central lines are giving you a sense, I think, of the scientific uncertainty surrounding the processes that contribute to sea level rise. So you combine those two things, scientific uncertainties about processes and our uncertainty about emissions trajectories, and you end up with at least, and I would say even more, at least this much uncertainty, and if you want to consider outlying possibilities that are perhaps quite unlikely, the error bars get even wider. If you think of this, try to put it in more human terms, just kind of another back of the envelope calculation. If we end up here at 2100, we're talking about our grandchildren living in a world where sea level is rising a foot every 120 years. Or they could be living in a world where sea level is rising a foot every 20 years. And obviously the sort of policy implications of that are very, very different. So I think it's very important to try to narrow those uncertainties to the extent that we can. A third method to hopefully try to do that is to find analogs in the past. So to use geologic methods to go back to times when Earth was actually warmer than it is today and ask with geologic methods, how did ice sheets actually respond to that warmth? Obviously, this is on the table of paleoclimatologists, but paleoclimate data can also help with the exercise of improving physics-based models, because modelers need something to compare. They need some reality to compare their models with to make sure that they really are improving their models and finding a better match to reality. So my goal, and this is sort of increasingly the focus of my newer work, is to go to places in Greenland, and there are many places like this, where you can find lakes near ice margins. And I, as a paleolimnologist, can work to try to reconstruct paleotemperatures and temperature history from lakes. And I can work with glacial geologists who understand how to reconstruct changes in the ice over time. So here's one such glacial geologist. This is Laura, doing very strange things to some bedrock in East Greenland to sample it for beryllium 10 dating. This work has all been collaborative with glacial geologists, with the idea being, I think temperature reconstructions and ice sheet reconstructions are so much more meaningful if you generate them both together nearby one another. Just an example of results that come out of this kind of work. The three curves over here are three previously existing data sets that have been used to infer past temperatures over Greenland. And we're still, as a community, kind of grappling with exactly how to interpret these and what, in addition to temperature, is affecting these records, and how much region-to-region variability there really is versus seasonal differences, and how changes in elevation of the ice sheet affect isotope records like this one that goes back and forth. So there's a lot to figure out in terms of Greenland's temperature history through the Holocene. This is my first contribution to trying to figure that out. The first midge-based temperature reconstruction that I published from Greenland. There are three curves there because that's three slightly different statistical models, because I just wanted to see how sensitive was my reconstruction to the exact statistics that I'm using. But the overall story from all three of those reconstructions is basically the same, and that's a July temperature anomaly reconstructed from midges from this lake here. And I want to compare that with work done by Nicholas Young as a dissertation student at University of Buffalo. He went around dating bedrock and glacial moraines using beryllium-10 and also lake sediments around this area. I want to show you some of his data. There are more data points I could add to this now, but the picture has not really changed significantly. So let's see. These are ages reported in thousands of years, so 10 means 10,000 years ago. We think this landscape started to be exposed to cosmic rays. So by 10,000 years ago, the ice had backed onto land here, what's now land. So through this period, we think the ice is retreating from the last glacial maximum. And then there are a couple of really prominent moraines on the landscape here that Nicholas dated. One is shown here with the ages associated with that, and he dated that moraine to about 8,200 years ago. The other dates to about 9,300 years ago. And so we think we have evidence, and these both, the geomorphology of these moraines strongly suggest re-advance of the ice. So we think that this ice margin re-advanced 8,200 and 9,300 years ago in response to some pretty well-known climate events at those times, cold snaps that lasted decades to centuries and affected Greenland and much of the North Atlantic, and to some extent larger parts of the world. And then when you date this landscape here, you find that ice was gone from the landscape very close to the present-day ice margin by about 7,500 years ago. So there's pretty rapid retreat across this landscape after that re-advance. And then ice was behind its present-day margin for much of the Holocene. Eventually, it started advancing again, presumably in response to that insulation-driven cooling through the late Holocene, reaching a maximum extent during the Little Ice Age, and then we've seen some retreat in the 20th century. So that's kind of the glacial geologic story from Nicholas's work. If we combine what we learned about midges and from glacial geology, what else can we say? I'm still thinking about that, but for starters, I think that it's interesting to see that the time when Nicholas says the ice sheet here was smaller than present day is the same time when we reconstruct the warmest temperatures using chironomids nearby. This is telling us either that this temperature record is reflecting a much larger regional pattern of temperature change, or possibly that the ice margin here responds pretty sensitively to the temperature change that's happening right there at the margin. Another point I want to make here is that I think that these readvances tell us that the ice sheet, and Nicholas thinks this also, the ice sheet is sensitive on a short time scale to climate change. It responds quickly to climate change, quickly enough that these short cold snaps, 9,300 and 8,200 years ago, caused readvances, despite the fact that overall this is a time period of high solar insolation, rapid retreat of the ice margin. Retreat stopped and we had readvance because of these short cold snaps. I think that that also tells us that the quite rapid retreat that happened across this landscape after that readvance has to be a response to climate at that time, responding in the moment to the climate at that time. It was suggested at one point that this rapid retreat was a delayed response to the really big warming that happened at the last glacial termination, the end of the last ice age. We come into the Holocene, really big warming. And maybe it just takes thousands of years for an ice sheet to equilibrate to that new Holocene climate. But I think maybe the fact that we have these readvances here suggests that that's not the case, that this is really a response to the temperatures at that time, warming at that time. But I would like to know what any of you think about that idea. A final point that I want to make about modeling. And in the work that I'm doing with Meredith and Eric, we're also collaborating with Sean Burkle at University of Maine, who's an ice modeler. So I'm looking forward to much more sophisticated, like more in-depth exercises like this. But this figure resulted from just a short conversation that I had at a conference with Patrick Applegate, who was also working on ice sheet modeling. He's now at Penn State. And he was simulating the volume of the Greenland ice sheet through the late Quaternary, including the Holocene, and using as a sort of driver climate or temperatures inferred from GRIP isotopes. And that's common. You commonly see this as the climate forcing in ice sheet models, probably largely because these records are continuous and they do a great job describing really big climate shifts during, for example, late glacial times, Younger Dryas, and so on. So this is the driver here, and this is the resulting simulation of ice sheet volume through the Holocene. And down here, this line was Patrick's sort of sense from talking probably at the same conference with glacial geologists about what the Greenland ice sheet roughly actually did through the Holocene. There's a very big discrepancy. And the point that I want to make is that this period over which there's this big discrepancy is the same period where if you compare GRIP isotopes and this midge-based temperature record, there's a big discrepancy between those two as well. Or here in the mid-Holocene, I think it's the period where the match here is the worst and the match here is the worst. And that's not to say that this temperature record is the be-all, end-all, but just that we really need to do a better job, all of us, of finding more ways to get at temperature, reconstructing temperature at more sites using a wider range of archives and proxies so that we all have checks on one another and we can start to tease out. There's already a lot of work to tease out what these isotope records are really telling us. There's temperature in there. As you know, there are other things as well. But the more proxies, the more archives we use, the better we can tease out what's affecting midges that's not temperature, for example. So to wrap up, early Holocene temperatures drove early Holocene retreat. I think that that rapid retreat in the early Holocene near Jakobshavn was not a response to deglacial warming or the last glacial interglacial transition. Greenland ice sheet margins appear to be capable of pretty rapid retreat, at least this margin, which is a particular type of margin, with modest warming. We're not talking within the Holocene about magnitudes of warming that exceed what's forecast for the end of this century. Everything's kind of well within what we might see within this century. And along those lines, temperatures comparable to those forecasts for the end of this century appear to give you a smaller Greenland ice sheet. There's lots of work that shows that. And finally, we need more and we need better temperature reconstructions from Greenland. So I want to thank the many collaborators who contributed geochronology and glacial geology and some paleolimnological work to these studies. And thank all of you.
It seemed like in the first part of your talk, you were saying that the warmest temperatures were like 10,000 to 8,000. And in the second part of your talk, it looked like the warmest temperatures were centered around 6,000, which is the climatic upland. Did I miss something?
Not at all. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the more and more work I do, more and more sites, the more I see variability spatially. And so a next step for me is try to sort out what's going on with that. How is that real? The first question is that real, right? And to sort that out, I can compare my reconstructions with independent indicators of when were peak temperatures in these different places. And so far, I think that the midges agree quite well with what's known from other indicators locally at these different sites. So I think there's real spatial variability. And one possibility, one hypothesis that I had was that maybe the higher latitude sites were more tightly coupled to insulation forcing and less influenced by other things. And so maybe we'd see the earliest Holocene warmth at the higher latitude sites because that's when insulation peaked. But I don't think the data bear that one out. Maybe, so there's something that's modulating the local responses to insulation forcing, and I have some other hypotheses about that, but I think there's a lot of real spatial variability.
Yeah, I'm struck by the, we had a talk here last week by Chris Polachenski, who's a recently graduated IGERT from this department. And he was talking about how when he goes up on the Greenland ice sheet today and measures temperature changes, you really don't see much temperature change right now up on the top of the ice sheet. But we know from, say, the Thule weather station that the coasts are warming dramatically, some of the fastest warming places in the whole Earth over the last several decades. And so when you talk about this discrepancy of, when people use the summit ice core temperature records to derive their ice sheet models, we know that the edges of the ice sheet are where the action is, and we can see that today. And it really speaks to the need for more temperature reconstructions near the edges, right? I mean, I think that's an undeniable conclusion here.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just a couple methodology questions. So as Eric said, yeah, we should have these kind of temperature records probably all along the margins of the ice sheet. So why not do that? How hard is it to produce these records, or how much time does it take to produce these records? That's my first question. I guess.
Do you want me to answer that first?
Yeah.
This particular method is extremely time intensive, and no one's really found a way to speed it up because it relies on an individual picking through sediments and looking for these tiny bug heads and picking them out one by one and then identifying them. There's not a heavy liquid separation or chemical extraction or something that conveniently just gets you all your chironomid heads. And it's much different from pollen and diatom analysis in that sense, in that the prep stage takes a lot of work. So the limitation is kind of, there's not a lot of people who do it, and it takes a lot of time, which means money and grants.
So second question is, you're reproducing all these temperature records, and in some places you've said, okay, well, there are only temperature records that go back to 1950, but have you done this in places where there are longer term temperature records, and can you compare your results with actually observations, and how do they compare?
Yeah, I would like to do some of that. For example, around the Lulasat, there's potential to do that because the instrumental records are relatively long there, and that's not what I wanted to show here. Where is it? Here we go. So this work was, I think, part of my dissertation, a really early postdoc work, where I compared midge-based temperature, basically shifts in midge assemblages with a long instrumental record from Iceland. And this is the instrumental record that's closer to the study site, but they're pretty strongly correlated. And the resolution that I was able to achieve is so much lower than the instrumental record that limits how much we can say. But I felt that this helped make an argument that midge shifts seem to be quite sensitive to temperature change there. But I think that would be a great thing to do. It's just it's that trade-off between putting your effort into counting a whole bunch of samples over this tiny time period and developing a downcore record, but it's really important to know how your proxy is behaving. There are differences definitely between sites in terms of how reliably this proxy relates to temperature. And so even if you do that kind of detailed work at one site, it doesn't necessarily tell you that the lake next door is going to behave the same way.
It's actually a really good segue to my question. You said in Baffin there are tons of lakes around there, and you can see it all over the Dr. Southern satellite image. How do you choose the lakes for your field sites in particular?
So that's a good question. Logistics are a very big piece of it. So where can you actually get to? For this particular, so it's tricky if you're part of a multi-proxy study because everyone has a slightly different ideal lake in mind. For midges, there's a certain range of lake depth and size that I like because it's where I feel like I've gotten the best results in the past. And then thinking sort of more broadly, I like to work way beyond tree line in sites where there's very little soil and very little vegetation because I think that removes a lot of the confounding factors that can really strongly influence lake ecology over time. If you've got soils developing over a 10,000 year period and tree line migrating in and alder migrating in, like we have at some sites in Alaska, then it's a lot harder, I think, to pull out a temperature signal. That's why North Greenland is really great, because not a lot of soil.
So in North Greenland, is the 10-degree threshold the meaningful one in terms of what the temperatures are like in the lakes throughout the year?
The 10 degree, do you mean?
Well, because you kind of separated it across the 10 degrees. Do these northern lakes really get up that high?
You know, I think I must have put the wrong label on that because I think it was less than 5 to 10, and greater than 10. Yeah, that's not right. I'm sorry about that.
One of the problems with DCA factor analysis, whatever you want to call it, is that when you combine variables into a component and then try to extract something from that, you can easily run into no analog situations. In other words, combinations that don't show up in the surface that you're using to calibrate. So did you do anything to ensure that you weren't looking at situations where there was no modern analog for it?
So in that ordination, I don't think that that's an issue, but are you thinking about the temperature inferences and the calibration data that we use for that exercise? Yeah, so that's a thorny thing because kind of all we can really do is either look at what's presently living in a lake or look at the uppermost sediments that we think represent what's presently living in a lake, and assume that that's sort of natural ecosystem that would exist at that climate. But there's really no natural pristine ecosystem left on Earth, so it is problematic. Is that getting at what you're getting at? You're just asking about no analogs and how do we deal with paleo, no analog situations?
But do the assemblages that you see geographically spread out today, do they repeat down core?
Yeah, so in general, late Holocene assemblages in all these lakes look quite similar to modern assemblages somewhere, usually not that far from the lake itself. When you get down into the early Holocene, you tend to get less good, more poor analogs for the early Holocene. Interestingly, the last interglacial and the older stuff doesn't really get much worse than the early Holocene. The assemblages are through the last interglacial are quite similar to the assemblages through the Holocene. And so analogs don't get really, really poor as you get farther back in time. They're about as poor as for the early Holocene. Yeah, the method the weighted averaging method that I'm using to derive the temperature reconstructions, in theory, can deal with no analog situations because it's not really looking for an analog in an assemblage, and it's looking across the assemblage at the the modern environmental tolerances of each taxon. And so in the literature, you'll see weighted averaging kind of listed as the best of. If you have to have poor analogs, it's the best thing you can do. But I agree that it's still problematic. Yeah. And so I usually try to report the strength of modern analogs for paleo data, for paleo samples alongside the temperature reconstruction, so people can decide for themselves whether to believe the temperature reconstructions.
And one of your slides, I think you gave a wide range of 1 foot over 120 years versus 1 foot every 20 years, and then based on what you can pick up of the paleo data, what is your sense for what direction, which side would it likely fall toward?
I don't think I have the knowledge to answer that. I don't think I'm a good person yet to try to narrow those error bars. There may be people in the room who have strong opinions about sort of where we're going. I mean, one of the sources of that big uncertainty is which emissions trajectory we're on, and so far we're on a higher one of those and not on one of the lower ones, but we're early in this century. So I can kind of probably make a prediction about what we're going to do in terms of emissions, maybe better than I can about what the ice sheets are going to do at this point.
Okay, well, thank you for answering.